All right, y'all, a ton of legal updates to get to today on Real Estate Backstage. Number one, we have Fed Governor Lisa Cook filing a lawsuit against Donald Trump, who, of course, is trying to remove her from her position on the FOMC. Number two, we have an appeals court rejecting the underlying legal basis for Trump's reciprocal tariffs. I think a lot of us saw this coming. And number three, this one surprised me the most. A judge has ruled in favor of a property manager over a tenant in an ESA case. All that and more today on Real Estate Backstage. Now, before we jump in, if you're watching on YouTube or listening on Apple Podcast or Spotify, go ahead and subscribe to the show. That way you don't miss any future episodes. And if you're looking for the show notes with links to all the articles we're going to reference today, you can find that at realestatebackstage.com/episode 37. Now, if this is your first time watching or listening, I'm your host, Michael Smith. I'm the CEO of Bluefield. We are a 4-time Inc. 5000 company headquartered here in Greenville, South Carolina. And we provide real estate brokerage, property management, and insurance services. All right, so we're going to get started today with this article from the Wall Street Journal. Quote, President Trump's attempt to fire Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook is the most dramatic step yet in his effort to take control of the independent central bank and its vast authority over interest rates. Trump has for months demanded that the Fed lower rates to boost the economy, make housing more affordable, and lower the cost of servicing the national debt. He has castigated Fed Chair Jerome Powell for not moving sooner to cut them. By replacing Cook, he could add enough voices to the 7-member Board of Governors to potentially outvote Powell and move interest rates in his preferred direction. Trump's decision to remove Cook set up a clash over how much power the president has at the central bank. Cook said late Monday night that Trump has no authority to fire her and that she would continue in her job. Her lawyer, Abby Lowell, said on Tuesday that Cook plans to sue to retain her position. The Fed said that the central bank will abide by any court decision and that it remains committed to independence. Trump's move comes at a delicate moment. The Fed has held interest rates steady at between 4.25 and 4.5% for 5 straight policy meetings so far this year, largely out of concern that tariffs would maintain upward pressure on inflation, currently above the Fed's 2% target. But in a speech last week, Powell, citing risks to the labor market, began to shift Fed officials toward a possible interest rate cut as soon as next month. Now this month, since we're in September. Meanwhile, candidates to succeed Powell as Fed chair when his term expires in May are angling for Trump's favor in public and in private. The resignation this month of Fed Governor Adriana Kugler, appointed by President Joe Biden, already gave Trump a vacancy on the board. He has nominated a close advisor, Stephen Moran, who awaits Senate confirmation. The 2 governors whom Trump appointed during his first term, Michelle Bowman and Christopher Waller, voted against the committee's decision last month to hold rates steady, arguing for a cut instead. Board members vote on interest rates alongside 5 independently appointed Reserve Bank presidents, but more Trump-aligned governors on the board could mean more momentum toward the rate cuts that Trump has pressed for. While the immediate effect on the pace or size of interest rate cuts is unclear, the longer-term effect is more significant. By getting more control of the Fed, Trump could influence the direction and level of interest rates for the rest of his term. The immediate effect of cuts could be a boost to spending and growth, but the longer-term risk is higher inflation if Trump's appointees go on to hold rates lower than economic conditions warrant, unquote. So this is definitely unprecedented. We've never had a president exert this much pressure on the Federal Reserve, which, again, is supposed to be an independent central bank, not swayed by the politics of whoever happens to be running the executive branch. And we've never had a president seek to actually remove a sitting Fed governor from their position. So keep in mind, this is all predicated on the alleged mortgage fraud which Lisa Cook allegedly committed. You may remember last week on the show, we covered this story where she had supposedly applied for primary residence status mortgages on 2 different homes at pretty much the same time, which is not something you're supposed to do. Again, we've got to wait for all the facts to come out. I'm sure she'll get her day in court. But as of right now, Trump is trying to use that as leverage to get her out. And listen, Trump, I don't think he could care less about Lisa Cook specifically. This isn't about Lisa Cook. This is about Trump trying to get his way by whatever means necessary. He tried to go after Powell. Powell hasn't caved. So now he's trying to go after other Fed governors to create vacancies that he can fill so he gets more votes on the FOMC. All right, so speaking of more votes on the FOMC, Waller calls for a 1/4 point cut in September. This is according to RIS Media. Quote, Federal Reserve Bank Governor Christopher Waller, during a speech at the Economic Club of Miami, once again pledged his vote for a rate cut at the next Federal Open Market Committee meeting, while noting his concerns about the labor market. Citing weakened job growth, tariff pressures, and rising risks to the labor market, Waller said he would vote for a 25 basis point rate cut at the September 16th, 17th meeting. While there are signs of a weakening labor market, I worry that conditions can deteriorate further and quite rapidly, and I think it is important that the FOMC not wait until such deterioration is underway and risk falling behind the curve in setting appropriate monetary policy, he explained. Though the FOMC should have started to cut rates in July, added Waller, he doesn't think cutting by more than a quarter point is needed in September. Now, I think that that's what we're going to see. I think we're going to see 25 basis points. There's some people that think we're going to see 50, but I just don't necessarily see that happening. Now, that view, of course, could change if the employment report for August points to a substantially weakening economy and inflation remains well contained, he said. I don't believe that policy has fallen substantially behind the curve, but one way to signal that I don't intend to allow that to happen is to talk about where we go after September. Looking ahead, Waller said he anticipates additional rate cuts in the next 3 to 6 months, driven by the incoming data. Focusing on the job data, Waller pointed out that the past 3 consecutive months have shown weak job creation data, unquote. So again, we saw a really abysmal jobs report recently where the number of new jobs being created for the last several months was revised downward pretty significantly. That's what prompted Trump to oust the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, even though that's the same individual who oversaw downward revisions under Joe Biden's watch as well. We talked about that previously on the show as well. All right, so speaking of the Fed and speaking of inflation, we have the updated PCE numbers, which is the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index, and that is showing inflation continues to edge higher. This is according to RIS Media. Quote, annual inflation edged higher but was in line with expectations in July, showing some impact from tariffs, as seen in the BLS's statistics, Consumer Price Index, and now reflected in the PCE, Personal Consumption Expenditure Index, from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the BEA. Both are primary inflation measures, with the PCE favored by the Federal Reserve. The PCE Price Index posted a monthly increase of 0.2% compared to June's 0.3%. Excluding food and energy costs from the index, the monthly increase was 0.3%, the same as it was in June. The index's annual inflation was 2.6% in July, unchanged from the rate of annual inflation reported in the June index. Excluding food and energy costs, the annual inflation in the PCE index was 2.9%, slightly higher than the June reading of 2.8%. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell has previously hinted that the Fed will likely cut interest rates at its September FOMC meeting. At the July FOMC, Fed board members Michelle Bowman and Christopher Waller dissented from the majority and voted to cut interest rates. The Federal Reserve has consistently said that its target for annual inflation is 2%. It remains to be seen how the central bank will adjust monetary policy beyond September if inflation continues to inch up away from that goal, unquote. So that is definitely a question. Keep in mind the Fed has a dual mandate. They are looking for full employment and price stability. So they want to keep the unemployment rate low and they want to keep the inflation low. And those two things are typically at odds with each other. So when inflation got really crazy, they responded to that by tightening monetary policy, raising interest rates. Now, when you do that, when you try to bring inflation down by raising interest rates, that tends to slow down the economy, which has negative impacts on the labor market. That's why we're starting to see the unemployment rate go up. We're seeing, slight increase in initial weekly claims for unemployment benefits and things like that. So that is the risk of keeping interest rates too high too long, is that it really weighs too heavy on the economy and people start to lose their jobs. All right, shifting gears, an appeals court has rejected Trump's reciprocal tariffs. Now, this is according to the Wall Street Journal. Quote, a federal appeals court late Friday struck down the Trump administration's signature tariffs, finding that the president had gone too far in his use of emergency powers to rewrite U.S. trade policy. The 7-4 ruling from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit upheld a lower court decision that undercuts a core tenet of President Trump's economic agenda. The majority found the president overstepped his authority under a 1977 law known as the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or the IEEPA. The decision is a significant blow to one of the signature policies of Trump's second term and sets the stage for the case to go to the Supreme Court. The appeals court allowed the tariffs to remain in place through mid-October to allow the parties time to ask the high court to hear the case. Trump railed against the decision in a post on Truth Social, in all caps, all tariffs are still in effect, exclamation point. Today, a highly partisan appeals court incorrectly said that our tariffs should be removed, but they know that the United States of America will win in the end, he wrote. Trump imposed the so-called reciprocal levies on virtually every U.S. trading partner in April, in an event that he labeled Liberation Day, setting off days of market chaos and uproar from foreign governments. Modified tariff rates were put in place in early August, though talks with many nations continue. The reciprocal tariffs account for about 70% of projected tariff revenue in 2026, according to estimates from the Tax Foundation, though the administration is also planning to ramp up levies under other legal authorities unaffected by the Friday decision. The levies voided by the decision included baseline tariffs of 10% on virtually all countries, as well as steeper tariffs on countries the administration considers bad actors on trade, and an additional set of tariffs on Canada, China, and Mexico. The decision, even if upheld by the Supreme Court, won't cancel all of Trump's second-term tariffs. Alongside the so-called reciprocal tariffs, Trump has also imposed a number of levies on industries, including automobiles, steel, aluminum, and copper, under a separate national security authority. Those tariffs are unaffected by the ruling, and the administration plans to expand them over the next few months, in part to provide a backstop if the IEEPA tariffs are overturned. In ruling against Trump, the appeals court majority, in an unsigned opinion, said IEEPA bestows significant authority on the president to undertake a number of actions in response to a declared national emergency, but none of these actions explicitly include the power to impose tariffs, duties, or the like, or the power to tax. Nowhere in the statute does the term tariffs or synonyms like tax and duty appear, the court observed. When Congress intends to delegate to the president the authority to impose tariffs, it does so explicitly, the court said. This is no surprise, as the core congressional power to impose taxes such as tariffs is vested exclusively in the legislative branch by the Constitution, unquote. So we've talked about this before on the show. The legal basis that Trump has been using for these reciprocal tariffs pretty much across the board in every country is that our trade deficits constitute some type of national emergency. That is an incredibly, incredibly weak argument. And I've said this multiple times on the show that this is likely to happen. Some of the tariffs are going to stay in place, the industry-specific ones, if he can make the case that those really are necessary for our national security. You could make the case that, for example, we need to onshore more steel, aluminum, microchips, things like that, because those things are used heavily by our Defense Department, and we don't want our supply chains to be compromised. However, putting a 10% across-the-board tariff on every good from every country, it's really, really hard to make the case that that's necessary for a national security reason. All right, shifting gears, the CFPB moves to limit non-bank supervision. This is according to Housing Wire. Quote, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, this week proposed a new definition for risks to consumers when supervising non-banks. In practice, the change would shift the Bureau's focus away from cases involving immaterial potential harm and towards serious misconduct, limiting its enforcement actions against these non-banks. Now, keep in mind that the CFPB actually just got the green light recently to continue its plans to lay off 90% of its workforce. Yes, that's 99.0% of its workforce. So there's going to be very, very limited enforcement capacity left at the CFPB. This will ensure that the Bureau acts within the bounds of its statutory authority and provide clarity to institutions about the standard the Bureau applies, the CFPB said in the proposed rule published in the Federal Register on Tuesday. Under the Consumer Financial Protections Act of 2010, the CFPB has the authority to supervise non-banks when there is a reasonable cause to believe they have engaged in conduct posing risk to consumers in connection with financial products and services. Until now, however, the Bureau has not defined what risk to consumers means, a gap it says has led to inconsistent interpretations, uncertainty for institutions, and the inclusion of cases involving only immaterial potential harm. The proposed rule clarifies that conduct posing risk to consumers includes only conduct that presents a high likelihood of significant harm to consumers and is directly connected to the offering or provision of a consumer financial product or service as defined in Section 1002 of the CFPA. In the Bureau's preliminary view, Congress would not have expected it to expand its supervisory resources on issues that are speculative in likelihood or trivial in impact, the CFPB said, unquote. All right, this one is probably my favorite piece of news from the week. I'm going to read a quick excerpt here from Todd Ortside's PM Assist newsletter. Quote, in July 2022, Ms. Henderson rented an apartment at Almond Tree Apartments in Louisiana. The property is owned by 5 Properties, LLC, and managed by Tonti Management, a local multifamily and corporate rental management company. Ms. Henderson had a dog named Titus, and she paid a $350 non-refundable pet fee at the time. But fast forward a year, and she wanted to move to another property owned and managed by the same companies, Sun Lake Apartments. This time, she handled it differently. Instead of paying the pet fee, which is $400 at the new property, She claimed that Titus was now an ESA, an emotional support animal, and that she expected the fee to be waived. When challenged on it, she went out and got an ESA letter from Steph Lee, a gender-affirming care nurse practitioner. All right, so here's what happened next. The management company here refused to waive the $400 pet fee, but they did offer to split it up into 4 payments of $100 over the course of 4 months. Now, the tenant refused and filed a complaint with HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is in charge of investigating fair housing complaints. They did an investigation, and they actually recommended to the DOJ that they bring charges against this management company over violations of the Federal Fair Housing Act. However, the DOJ looked at it and decided not to bring the lawsuit. So then the tenant, Ms. Henderson, took matters into her own hands and filed her own lawsuit against the management company. And it went to court, and the judge actually ruled in favor of the management company. So the guidance from HUD, I think back in 2000, was that if someone is claiming an emotional support animal as a reasonable accommodation for a disability, either a physical or mental disability, their guidance is that all pet fees need to be waived because that animal should not be considered a pet. The animal is considered a reasonable accommodation. So in this particular instance, this management company was a clear violation of HUD's guidance. However, the judge here ruled that HUD actually never had the authority to make that rule in the first place because it goes way beyond the scope of the actual statute. Now, the reason that this was possible is because of a recent Supreme Court decision that overturned what was called Chevron deference. Now, the way that things worked with Chevron deference in place essentially was whenever there was any type of ambiguity or uncertainty over interpretation of a piece of a statute, the judiciary would basically leave it up to the agency under the executive branch that was in charge of implementing and enforcing that law to interpret the law. And so basically what we ended up with was unelected bureaucrats who are supposed to be just enforcing the law, actually legislating and coming up with new rules that people basically had to follow. Now that Chevron deference has been overturned, when there's something that an agency is doing, like HUD, making up these rules about, ESAs and, landlords having to waive pet fees, whenever there's something like that that the agency is doing that isn't explicitly allowed for in the statute, now we can go to the judiciary and have them review the case and make a decision and actually have a judge do what they're supposed to do and interpret the law. So I'm sure that the tenant in this scenario is probably going to appeal, so he may not have had the final word yet on this case, but for now, this is a big win for real estate professionals. All right, shifting gears, new home sales declined in July. This is according to Inman. Quote, sales of newly constructed single-family homes continued to slide in July as builders faced a market of buyers who are not responding favorably to higher mortgage rates and home prices. Sales of new single-family homes declined 8.2% year over year and dropped 0.6% month over month to a seasonally adjusted annual rate of 652,000, according to data released on Monday by the U.S. Census Bureau and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Economists polled by Reuters anticipated that new single-family home sales would increase to a rate of 630,000 units. By the end of July 2025, the seasonally adjusted estimate of new homes for sale was 499,000, down 0.6% from the previous month's estimate and 7.3% above the July 2024 estimate of 465,000. The sales pace for June was also upgraded from the reported pace last month of 627,000 up to 656,000. At the current sales rate, 499,000 homes for sale represents a 9.2 month supply of inventory, which is equal to inventory levels from June of 2025. That inventory estimate is up 16.5% year over year from July's 2024 estimate of 7.9 months. Meanwhile, the median sales price ticked down 0.8% from the month before to 403.8. That price is also 5.9% below the July 2024 median sales price of 429. The average sales price of new homes sold during July 2025 was 487.3, which is 3.6% below the June 2025 average sales price and 5% below the July 2024 average sales price. There's a glut of homes for sale, both new homes and existing homes, and buyers aren't interested at these prices and mortgage rates. Heather Long, chief economist at Navy Federal Credit Union, said in a statement emailed to Inman, home builders are trying to move inventory by offering price cuts and incentives, but it's not enough to lure most buyers yet. It's telling that the median price of a new home is now slightly below the median price of existing homes for sale, a sign of how much home builders are trying to entice buyers, unquote. So home builders are sitting on a ton of inventory nationally. Obviously, this varies by region, by state, by local market, but at the national level, home builders are sitting on quite a lot of inventory. And now we've also seen a pretty significant decline in the number of permits for new homes to be constructed. This means that builders are being really cautious. They're sitting on a lot of inventory. They're having to drop prices and give incentives. They're unsure about what consumer behavior is going to be in the near future based on all the economic uncertainty with the labor market, inflation, interest rates. So builders are just being really cautious right now. They're trying to wind down and unload their inventory so they're not sitting on a bunch of unsold homes. All right, so we're going to wrap up with the story from Inman. Quote, home prices in the U.S. saw modest annual gains during the month of June and during the second quarter of the year, but were not enough to match inflation with which consumers are currently grappling. According to data released by the U.S. Federal Housing Finance Agency on Tuesday, home prices in the U.S. rose 2.9% between Q2 2024 and Q2 2025, but remained flat between the first and second quarters of the year. Meanwhile, according to the S&P Totality Case-Shiller Index, formerly known as the S&P CoreLogic Case-Shiller Index, released on Tuesday, national home prices increased by 1.9% year over year in June. This was the slowest pace the index hit in the last 2 years, unquote. So I was actually just talking with our agents about this last week in our company all-hands meeting. Home prices are still going up. The rate of growth is decelerating. So the rate of appreciation is slowing down. In certain parts of the country, we're seeing prices go down, certain parts of Florida, Texas, but overall, across the nation, we're seeing, depending on which source you look at, either 1.9 or 2.9%. But keep in mind that inflation is also in the high 2s or low 3s, depending on what source you're looking at, whether it's the PCE, CPI, core CPI. So home prices are still going up, but they're maybe just breaking even with inflation or maybe lagging behind inflation a little bit. All right, y'all, that's a wrap for the show today. Just a reminder, you can find the show notes with links to all the articles we referenced today at realestatebackstage.com/episode 37. I'll see you here next week with another behind the scenes look at the real estate industry here on Real Estate Backstage.